There's a very specific moment when an avoidant doesn't just notice your silence. They feel it, not because you announced you were done, not because you sent a dramatic message, but because something fundamental changed. You stopped chasing. You stopped explaining. You stopped trying to earn clarity from someone who thrived on keeping you uncertain. And here's the truth most people never talk about. When an avoidant realizes you've truly given up, it doesn't bring them peace. It triggers a quiet internal collapse, not all at once, but in stages. Because the person who once felt safely distant now feels something far more terrifying: irrelevance. This is the psychology behind what happens next. At the very beginning, nothing dramatic happens on the surface. In fact, what happens internally is a quiet dismissal. The avoidant tells themselves a story that keeps them comfortable. They assume this silence is temporary, that you're just pulling back to get their attention, that you'll return once the discomfort becomes too much for you. This belief isn't arrogance as much as it is conditioning. They've learned through repeated experience that distance creates pursuit. So when you disappear emotionally, their mind reaches for the most familiar explanation: they'll be back. This dismissal serves a psychological purpose. It protects them from feeling anything too deeply, too quickly. If they acknowledge that you're truly gone, they would have to face uncertainty, loss, and emotional exposure all at once. That's overwhelming for someone who survives by staying one step removed from vulnerability. So instead, they downplay the shift. They label it drama, a phase, or a silent protest, anything except the truth that something has fundamentally changed. At this stage, they may even feel a subtle sense of relief. Your absence seems to confirm their belief that closeness is unstable and emotional bonds are unreliable. They tell themselves that this is exactly why they never fully leaned in. In their mind, emotional distance equals safety, and your withdrawal appears to validate that worldview. The irony is that this sense of calm is artificial. It's built on denial, not peace. What unsettles them, though, is the quality of the silence. It doesn't feel reactive. There's no emotional charge behind it. No anger, no guilt-inducing messages, no sudden bids for reassurance. You're not trying to be understood. You're not trying to be chosen. And that's unfamiliar. Avoidants are comfortable managing emotional intensity, even negative intensity. What they're not comfortable with is emotional absence that doesn't ask for anything in return. They may check their phone more often without realizing why. They may reread old conversations, not out of longing yet, but out of confusion. Something isn't lining up with the pattern they know. Your usual emotional availability isn't there to reassure them of their impact, but instead of questioning themselves, they double down on dismissal. They assume time will reset things, that you'll miss them, that you'll feel the pull to reconnect. This stage is marked by overconfidence in the past. They rely on old dynamics to explain a new reality. And because you've always shown up before, they expect history to repeat itself. They don't yet feel the loss. They feel entitled to your return. But beneath that entitlement is the first crack, an unspoken awareness that this silence feels different. It's not loud enough to panic them yet, but it's quiet enough to linger. And that quiet begins to disturb the story they've been telling themselves, even if they're not ready to admit. As the days pass, dismissal no longer fully works. The familiar explanation starts to wobble because the usual emotional cues never arrive. There's no follow-up message, no subtle reach-out, no moment where you accidentally reappear just enough to restore the old dynamic. This is when confusion quietly replaces confidence. The avoidant doesn't feel panic yet, but they feel disoriented. Something in the rhythm has broken and they can't quite name what it is. They begin replaying the pattern they relied on for so long. Normally, distance would create tension and tension would pull you closer. Normally, silence would be followed by reassurance. But now silence is followed by more silence, and not the passive kind. The kind that feels intentional, grounded, and emotionally complete. That's what unsettles them. You're not withholding to provoke. You're not waiting to be noticed. You're simply not there. Internally, this creates a subtle cognitive clash. Their mind wants to believe they're still in control of the emotional temperature, yet reality suggests otherwise. They may find themselves wondering when the shift actually happened. Was it something they said, something they didn't say? Did they miss a moment where you quietly decided you were done? These questions surface not because they're suddenly self-reflective, but because the external feedback they depended on has disappeared. Confusion intensifies because they can't locate themselves in your emotional world anymore. Before, even when they pulled away, they knew where they stood. They knew you cared. They knew you were emotionally reachable. Now that certainty is gone, and uncertainty is far more uncomfortable for an avoidant than conflict. Conflict can be managed. Distance without access cannot. They may test the waters in indirect ways, watching stories, checking activity, revisiting shared spaces online, not to reconnect openly, but to orient themselves, to see if they still matter, to confirm they still exist in your awareness. When those checks don't yield reassurance, the confusion deepens. The silence begins to feel less like a tactic and more like a boundary. This is the stage where they start feeling something they rarely sit with: displacement. They don't know where they belong anymore in the dynamic. You're no longer reacting to their timing, their moods, or their emotional availability. And because avoidants are accustomed to defining closeness on their terms, losing that reference point feels destabilizing. What makes this stage particularly uncomfortable is that there's nothing to push against. You're not demanding answers. You're not asking for clarity. There's no confrontation to shut down or avoid. Your absence offers no friction, only space. And space, when it's no longer controlled, becomes threatening. They haven't reached fear yet. They haven't reached regret. But the confidence that carried them through the first stage is fading. In its place is a quiet unease, a sense that the rules they understood no longer apply. And while they may not admit it out loud, a realization begins to form beneath the confusion. Whatever this is, it's not the same as before, and they don't know how to get back to what they once took for granted. Once confusion settles in, it doesn't stay neutral for long. It slowly turns inward. The avoidant may not consciously label it this way, but this is where the experience becomes an ego threat. Because when your absence persists, when your calm detachment doesn't crack, the question quietly shifts from what's going on to what does this say about me? Up until now, they could explain your silence as timing, mood, or strategy. But as days turn into weeks, those explanations lose credibility. And in that gap, self-doubt slips in. Not the vulnerable, emotionally expressive kind, but a sharp, uncomfortable awareness that their presence may no longer hold the power it once did. For someone who has always felt secure, knowing they could pull you back if needed, this realization cuts deep. They start measuring themselves against an unspoken standard. Why didn't you try harder? Why didn't you push? Why didn't you demand reassurance? In their mind, your fight for the connection used to be proof of their value. Your emotional effort validated their importance without requiring them to fully show up. Now that effort is gone, and without it, they're left alone with an unsettling thought. Maybe they weren't as irreplaceable as they believed. This stage is particularly destabilizing because avoidants often anchor their self-worth in being wanted, not in being emotionally present. They feel safer being the one pursued rather than the one pursuing. Your withdrawal flips that dynamic. It places them in a position where their seriability is no longer being confirmed externally, and that absence of validation doesn't just sting. It challenges the identity they've relied on. They may attempt to restore their ego in subtle ways, comparing themselves to others in your life, wondering if someone else has taken their place, imagining scenarios where you moved on faster than expected. These thoughts aren't driven by longing yet. They're driven by wounded pride. The idea that you could be okay without them threatens the internal story that they were the emotional center of the dynamic. At the same time, they feel a strange resistance to reaching out. Admitting curiosity would mean admitting vulnerability. Asking where they stand would mean risking rejection. And for an avoidant, that risk feels far more dangerous than silent self-questing. So instead, they sit with the discomfort. They replay moments where they pulled away thinking those moments increased their value. Only now those same moments look like missed chances. This is where defensiveness can show up internally. They may justify their behavior, remind themselves of your flaws, downplay the connection, anything to regain a sense of emotional superiority. But these defenses don't fully work anymore because deep down something has shifted. Your giving up didn't just remove access, it removed affirmation. They may never articulate it, but this stage introduces a painful awareness. The power they thought they held wasn't unconditional. It depended on your willingness to stay emotionally available. And now that you've stopped offering that availability, they're left facing a question they were never comfortable asking. Who am I if I'm no longer being chosen? After the ego has been quietly shaken, something unexpected begins to happen beneath the surface. The emotional wall they've relied on for protection starts to weaken, not because they chose to lower it, but because there's no longer anyone pressing against it. And in that stillness, feelings they successfully avoided for so long begin to drift back in. Not all at once, not in a dramatic rush, but slowly and without their permission. This is the stage where emotional backflow begins. The mind starts supplying memories uninvited, small moments, your tone, your consistency, the way you showed up without being asked. These recollections don't come with longing at first. They come with surprise. The avoidant didn't think those moments mattered. They assumed they were replaceable, forgettable, ordinary. But now, with distance firmly in place, those memories carry weight. What makes this stage uncomfortable is that the feelings don't arrive in real time. Avoidants don't process emotions while they're happening. They process them after safety is restored, after distance is created. But this time the distance is too complete. There's no easy way back. And that's why the emotions finally have room to surface. They may start idealizing the connection in hindsight, not because it was perfect, but because it was emotionally stable. Your presence didn't demand performance. You didn't overwhelm them with intensity. You offered something rare, steadiness. And now that steadiness feels conspicuously absent from their life, they might catch themselves wondering how you're doing. Not in a controlling way, but in a genuinely curious one. Are you okay? Are you happier? Did you move on? These questions signal a shift. The emotional narrative is no longer about dominance or distance. It's about loss, but it's a loss they don't quite know how to name yet. This stage is also marked by emotional contrast. They may date, distract themselves, or stay busy, but something feels flat. The interactions don't land the same way. The connection lacks depth, and without realizing it, they begin comparing new experiences to the one they dismissed. Not because they want you back consciously, but because their nervous system remembers what felt safe. What complicates this stage is that vulnerability still feels risky. Even as emotions resurface, reaching out feels dangerous. Admitting that they miss you would mean confronting the fear that pushed them away in the first place. So the feelings remain internal, unexpressed, unresolved. They may rationalize these emotions as nostalgia or loneliness, but the truth is deeper. They're finally feeling the emotional consequences of their distance. And because these feelings arrive late after the connection is faded, they carry a quiet urgency, not panic yet, but a dawning awareness that something meaningful slipped through their fingers while they were busy protecting themselves from it. This is the stage where the avoidant begins to feel you, not as a presence they managed, but as a loss they didn't anticipate. As the emotions settle in, they collide with something even more unsettling, the loss of control. This is the point where the avoidant realizes that whatever invisible access they once had to you is gone. Not temporarily, not as a tactic, but fundamentally. And that realization creates a specific kind of anxiety that you're not used to managing. Before, even in distance, there was a sense of leverage. They could reach out if they wanted. They could disappear and return on their terms. The connection moved to their rhythm, their comfort, their timing. Your emotional availability made that possible. Now your absence removes the anchor they relied on. There's no guarantee that a message would land, no assurance that they'd still be welcomed, and that uncertainty destabilizes them more than outright rejection ever could. This stage is where they begin monitoring instead of engaging. They observe rather than act. They notice that you're no longer orienting your life around their presence. Your energy isn't paused. You're not waiting. You've reclaimed your emotional autonomy. And that autonomy quietly intimidates them because control only works when the other person is emotionally invested and you're not playing that role anymore. Internally, this triggers a deep anxiety around irrelevance. They're not the emotional reference point in your world. Now they don't get to influence your mood, your decisions, or your sense of self. And for someone who equated emotional distance with power, this reversal feels disorienting. The very detachment they once relied on now leaves them on the outside. They may feel an urge to reassert control, but they don't know how to do it cleanly. A direct message would require vulnerability. An honest expression would require accountability. Both feel threatening. So instead, the impulse gets stuck. They hover mentally. They imagine scenarios. They rehearse messages they never send. All the while, the anxiety grows, not because they want closeness, but because they no longer get to decide the terms of distance. What unsettles them most is the finality they sense but can't confirm. Your silence isn't dramatic, it's grounded, and grounded silence signals closure. It suggests that you didn't leave impulsively, you left intentionally, that you didn't disappear to provoke, you disappeared to protect yourself. This is the moment where the power dynamic fully shifts. They didn't choose the ending, they didn't initiate the distance, and for someone who built emotional safety around control, that loss feels like a free fall. They're no longer managing the connection, they're reacting to its absence. This stage doesn't always lead to action, sometimes it leads to internal collapse. Instead, a quiet unraveling of the belief that they could always reach you if they wanted, because now wanting isn't enough. Access has to be earned, and that realization leaves them facing something they've long avoided: the cost of emotional disengagement when the other person finally walks away. By the time this stage arrives, the noise inside them has gone quiet. But not because things are resolved. It's quiet because there's nowhere left to move. The panic has burned out. The confusion has settled. And what remains is a heavy, unresolved awareness. They lost something, and they don't know how to get it back. This is where regret appears. Not dramatically, not urgently, but in a slow, lingering way that stays with them longer than they expect. They finally understand that the connection didn't end because of one moment or one mistake. It ended because of a pattern of avoidance, emotional withholding, half-presence. And the hardest part is that this realization comes with clarity, but no tools. They can see what went wrong, but they don't know how to repair it without exposing the very vulnerability they've spent their life avoiding. At this stage, they may want to reach out, but the idea of doing so feels paralyzing. What would they even say? "I miss you" feels too exposed. "I was wrong" feels too destabilizing. "Can we talk?" Risks hearing a response they're not prepared for. Regret alone doesn't give courage, and for an avoidant, courage requires emotional safety they don't know how to create. So instead of action, they sit with reflection. They replay moments where they pulled away and realized those were the exact moments that taught you to let go. They remember times you asked for clarity, for consistency, for reassurance, and how easily they dismissed those needs. Not because they didn't care, but because caring felt like pressure. Now in hindsight, those moments look like opportunities they quietly closed. This is also where idealization can take root. They don't just miss you. They miss the version of themselves they were when the connection felt effortless, when someone cared without conditions, when they didn't have to perform or chase. Your presence offered a kind of emotional grounding they didn't know how to appreciate while it was there, and now without it, they feel unanchored. What makes this stage especially painful is the awareness that timing has passed. You didn't leave in anger. You didn't leave to teach a lesson. You left because you reached acceptance. And acceptance is final in a way arguments never are. They sense that even if they reached out now, it wouldn't be the same version of you who once wait, Ed, you've changed. You've closed the door gently, but completely. This is where regret settles into something deeper than longing. It becomes a quiet reckoning, not just about losing you, but about facing the emotional cost of staying guarded for too long. They may not transform because of it. They may not suddenly become expressive or brave, but the awareness remains. And long after the connection ends, long after you've moved forward, this stage lingers with them as a silent reminder. They didn't lose you because you gave up too easily. They lost you because they never learned how to meet someone who stayed until staying was no longer an option. In the end, what this journey reveals is not the collapse of the avoidant, but the awakening of the person who stopped trying to earn love through endurance. The moment you gave up was not a moment of weakness. It was the moment you chose emotional self-respect over emotional survival. While the avoidant experienced confusion, ego threat, anxiety, and regret in stages, you experienced something far more powerful: clarity. You stopped negotiating for consistency, you stopped explaining your worth, and in doing so, you stepped out of a dynamic that only functioned as long as you were willing to carry the emotional weight alone. What makes this ending so profound is that nothing dramatic needed to happen for everything to change. There was no final argument, no explosive goodbye, no closure conversation that tied things neatly together. The ending came quietly through acceptance, and acceptance is the one thing avoidants are never prepared for because it removes the tension that once kept them in control. When you stopped reacting, you didn't punish them. You simply removed yourself from a role that no longer honored you. That absence did more than words ever could. For the avoidant, the internal collapse wasn't about losing a person. It was about losing a mirror. You reflected their importance without demanding accountability, and when that reflection disappeared, they were left facing themselves, not as the one who was chased, but as the one who failed to show up when it mattered. And while they may never articulate this truth out loud, it lives quietly inside them as a lesson learned too late. Emotional safety isn't created by distance, it's created by presence. For you, this ending marks a return to yourself. You didn't walk away because you stopped caring. You walked away because you cared enough to stop abandoning your own needs. You learned that love is not something you prove through patience or pain. It's something that meets you where you are. And once you experience the peace that comes from no longer waiting to be chosen, there was no going back to the version of you who accepted uncertainty as love. So this story doesn't end with revenge, validation, or even reconciliation. It ends with dignity, with the quiet strength of someone who chose emotional integrity over emotional chaos. And that is the final truth of this journey. When you gave up on chasing the avoidant, you didn't lose the relationship. You reclaimed your power. And while their internal collapse unfolded in stages, your healing began the moment you chose to walk away whole. Thank you for staying with me through this message, for listening with an open heart, and for giving yourself permission to reflect instead of react. If any part of this resonated, know that it's because you've grown, not because you were weak. Awareness is a sign of strength, and choosing yourself is never something you need to apologize for. Remember, your calm is not coldness, your silence is not punishment, and your boundaries are not cruelty. They are evidence of self-respect, and anyone who truly belongs in your life will never require you to abandon yourself just to keep them close. I appreciate you for being here, for leaning into this conversation, and for allowing space for healing and clarity. Take what serves you, leave what doesn't, and trust that the path ahead is lighter than the one you've been carrying. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart, stay grounded in your truth, and until next time, goodbye.